Hello and welcome back to this tutorial. In our previous video, we were able to deal with encapsulation using getters and setters the normal way, and then using getters and setters the Pythonic way to encapsulate our data in our class. We are going to be working with inheritance in object-oriented programming. So what is inheritance? Inheritance is a concept in object-oriented programming that allows a class to be extended, right? So we've been creating our class, and inheritance allows you to create a class as a superclass and then create other subclasses of that superclass, right? And the subclasses will have the features of that superclass and also be able to use the methods that are available in that superclass. Now, the subclasses can also have their own extra features apart from the one in the superclass or parent class, but then they will have the features that are in the superclass or the parent class. Okay, so now the main class is called the parent class or the superclass, and their extended classes or class for a singular unit is called the subclass or the child class. Okay, so without any further waste of your time, we're going ahead to create our classes and then to create the subclasses. So I'm going to create a new class here, and I'm going to call it bed, and I'm going to close this. So I'm going to define my init function, and VS Code has already completed that for us. So I'm going to pass in the parameters that I'll be using for this class. So what are the features that are peculiar to beds? So we can have their color, we can have their names, so and probably we can have type of wings. So I'm just going to represent it with wing. Okay, so now we're also going ahead to define our instance attributes. So I'm going to say self.color and set it to the color that we pass into the object, then self.name, we set it to name. So now I'm going to correct this so that we won't be running into any issues. But then, like I said before, the major item that you're going to be using is this self.name and not this name. Okay, so the only thing this name is here doing for you is that this self.name variable will pick it whenever it is passed as an argument. So I can as well return it back to name, right? So, and I'm going to say self.wing is equals wing. Okay, so now I'm going to create other methods or just a few methods that we can work with. Now I'm going to create a method that I'm going to call it bird type, and probably this method is going to tell us the kind of bird that is currently available, right? So, or the kind of bird that we currently have. So, and I'm going to pass in self here. So that is the only thing this method is going to do for us. So right now we are only going to return a print statement, and we are going to say that this we call the bird name is of so color and has also wing. So we are going to see that we are returning a print statement of a string, and we are going to pass in that string that says that this self.name, so we pass in our curly braces, is self dot that in color, right, and has the wing variable. So we're going to pass in self dot wing. Okay, so this is the only thing that this method is doing for us. Okay, so now I'm going to create a subclass of this class. So I'm going to call it parrots. And I'm going to pass in the bed class in here. So now this parrot class is inheriting from this bed class. And for now, I'm just going to write pass. So, and this pass, like we have already said, means don't do anything.
So for now, I'm going to create an object of the parrot class, and I'm going to call it parrot. I'm going to set it to, well, that class. I'm going to pass in all the parameters that we defined. So I'm going to pass in the color to be red, and the name is going to be James, and then I'll give it 2 wings. So now if I call this bed type method on this parrot, I want to print parrot dot bed type. So, and we run this, so we can see that this function that was defined in this class can work with this other class. Okay, so but if we remove this inheritance, as you can see, our method is no longer reflecting here as a method, right? So because it was able to access it as a result of this inheritance. Okay, so now what's the right way to go about this inheritance? Well, there are two cases of inheritance. One, the inheritance where you want to modify the attributes of your subclass, and the inheritance when you want to use the exact attributes of your superclass. So if you want to use the exact attributes that your superclass has, the first thing you need to do is to create the super init. Okay, so I'm going to define the init function, and so if I define the init function, so if I just hit enter, you see that VS Code has already created the init function and the super init function. So this super init enables you to inherit the init function of this class, and if you do not want to modify the new, and if you do not want to have extra parameters in your subclass, you can decide not to create this init function. You can just use the init function of this class. So, and if you want to modify the init function of your subclass, then you have to create another one and then pass the super init. So now assuming I want to modify this parrot class because there are some features that are peculiar to parrots that are not general to other birds. So I can pass in something like IQ, and we all know that parrots are very intelligent. So we can pass in something like IQ, that is intelligent quotient. And we can now come here and define the instance attribute of this IQ. So I'm going to say self.iq, and I'll set it to IQ. Okay, so that when you're creating an object of this parrot, you can as well pass in this IQ as a parameter or as an argument and use it to do what you want to do. Okay, so now let's create an object. So I'm going to create another object, and I will call it parrot2, and I will set it to, well, an object of the parrot class. So, and I'm going to pass in all the parameters again. So I'm going to pass in all the arguments that are needed. So this time I'm going to name this parrot Joy. And what else do we need? So I'm going to say it has 4 wings, weird parrot. And if I try to call a function on this parrot now without passing in this IQ, now that we have specified that we want an extra argument for this parrot class, that is definitely not going to work. So I can now say, now I can try to do that by calling that function. So, and I'm going to say parrot2 dot bed type. So, and if we run this, we have an error that we are missing one required argument, and that is IQ. Okay, so now I can say that the intelligence quotient of this parrot is like, well, maybe 70%, and now we have this method running for us successfully. Okay, so let's look at how these subclasses inherit methods. Okay, now we have seen that this subclass has actually inherited the superclass method. But if, for instance, you want to modify this bed type method under this subclass, you can actually do that. So assuming you want a generic bed type method for each of the classes, each of the subclasses that are created under this bed class, let's say you have another subclass of this bed and the name is probably dog. Yeah, because a dog is a type of bird, and you want generic bird type methods for each and every one of them, you can do that. So now that you have just this method for the subclasses, even if I create another class, so I create another class now, let's create the dog class and pass in the bird class too. And we can also have the init function. So now it has the init function. So now I'm going to pass in something extra here that is peculiar to ducks. Maybe their swimming speed, because ducks swim, okay? So how fast can they swim? So now, assuming this is another attribute that is peculiar to ducks, now I'm going to pass it in here, and I'll create an object of this duck class. So, and like we always do, we call it duck1, and we set it to the object of the duck class, and we pass in all our arguments. So this time we have, well, most ducks that I've seen, they are white. So, and I'm going to give it a name. So I can call it Fate. Maybe that's my pet name for the duck. And I'm going to give it two wings, and the swimming speed is going to be like maybe 20 meters per second. So I'm just going to pass in 20 there. So if I call this method here, right? Remember, we've not created any methods for these two classes that are inheriting the bed class. So if I call this bed type method, so, and again, I'll print so that we have a side effect, doc1 dot bed type. Okay. So now we can call this method, and this will work perfectly fine. So we can see that this fade is white in color and has two. Okay. We can modify this our print statement. So two wings. So, and let's run that again so that we have, yeah, I think that's better. So now, if for any reason you want generic print statements or generic features, if for any reason you want something generic to be returned for the different classes, so instead of this general print statement here, we can create this exact methods for the different subclasses. So we can, under this parrot class, we now come and define this method. So, and we want to define the bed type method. So you can see Python is already suggesting this bed type method for me. So, and what you see here is that VS Code is asking us whether we want to return the exact method of the superclass. So this is something that you would want to do, especially when you have something like multiple inheritance. Okay, so assuming I have another class that is inheriting both bird and parrot and duck. Okay, so assuming I have another class that is inheriting more than one classes, right? And I want it to inherit the exact methods or that are contained in these other two classes. So this is what I can use. So I can say return super dot that exact method. Okay, so, and by this, the two methods that are for those other two superclasses will be returned for me, and the two of them will run. But this time around, I don't want this to be returned. What I want is that I want to create a generic bed type method for the parrot class. So I want to check if the value that was passed in as the IQ is an integer. So I can say that I want to check if self.iq is in the range of 1 to 100. So I'm going to call the range function. So I can just pass in 100 here. So any figure between 1 and 100 would work. Okay. So, and what do I want to do? So I want to return the print statement and then pass in the IQ. So, and a better way to do this, so is if not, you can use if not. Okay. So you can say that if this is not happening, then you throw an error first. So you can say that you can return false and a string that says that IQ is out of range. So I can say IQ is out of range. I will now normally what I would want to return is, so I'll copy this return statement here and I will just paste it in here. And again, I'll pass in and I'll add comma here and I'll say IQ. So I think this would just do for the parrot class. If I call this self dot bed type for this parrot, so I would want to comment this out first so that we run only this. And well, this is working. But if I pass in an IQ that is out of range, let's say 101, now we can see that this else block runs for us. So it's not all the time that you just want to inherit the super method directly. Okay. So this is how the super methods can be inherited. They can be inherited directly or they could be modified. And also, you can decide to create a different method entirely for the subclasses that is not in the parent class. Okay, so now I'm going to copy this method that we created for this subclass and modify it a bit for the doc subclass. So now we have a bed type method for the doc subclass. So, but this time around we are going to modify it, and instead of this condition that we checked here, we can decide to check something else for the doc, right? So what do I want to check? So I'm going to pass in self.speed. Okay, so first of all, we are going to create the we are going to create the instant attributes of this speed. So we are going to say that self.speed is equal to speed. Okay, so now we can access it here. So self.speed, and it should be an integer. Okay, we can return false and say that speed must be an integer. Okay, so I'm going to also run this doc method here. So and we already have an integer, so I'll run it again. Okay, so we're having an error. We have to change this to self.speed, and let's clear our terminal and run this again. So now we have this. Okay, so let's modify this print statement for that, for the doc class, and we are going to say that and speed is self.speed. So we'll run it again, and this is working perfectly. If, for instance, I pass in maybe instead of this 20 here, I pass in something like a string, right? Or a float. So I can even say 2.5. So this is not an integer, and this is going to say we still have that. Okay, false, speed must be an integer. So now we can decide to just make a little changes to the different subclasses. Also, you can decide to define another method that is peculiar to the subclasses. Okay, for this doc method, we can create a swim method, and it's only dogs that swim. So we can define a swim method, and we pass in self. Here we are going to print, and we format our string and say that this dog, so we can decide to pass in the name. So we can say this dog, we pass in self.name. So we can say swims at the speed of, we can pass in self.speed. Okay, and for the parrot class, I can decide to create another method altogether that is peculiar to this parrot class. So, and I can call it speak because parrots speak. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to pass in self, and I can just print something that says, well, this parrot named self.name speaks. All right, so now we already created the objects of this classes, so I am not going to modify that. So I'm going to individually run, well, swim for the duck, and then I'm going to run speak for the parrot. So so now we see that this parrot named Joy speaks, and this dog named Faith swims at the rate of 2.5. Okay, so this none we are seeing here is because we are not returning anything for the both functions. Okay, so we are just giving a print statement. Okay, so instead of even printing this, we can just return it, print, call the method function, because method is already a print statement, so we will not have that non value there. Okay, so if we run this, we have this neatly printed for us. So I hope you understand the concept of inheritance. So thank you so much for watching this video, and see you in the next one.